HR called me in on a Thursday morning. I thought it was another routine meeting about restructuring. Instead, I left the building an unemployed man. Jake, after 17 years, the company's moving in a new direction, the HR rep said, eyes fixed on a pre-written statement. Your position has been eliminated. You'll receive standard severance, as outlined in policy. Standard policy. Two words that can strip a man of nearly 2 decades of loyalty. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just looked at the stack of papers she pushed across the table. Cold white pages detailing how a man's life is reduced to numbers and signatures. My name is Jake Turner, 49 years old. Until that Thursday, I was senior systems engineer at Grayson Dynamics, a tech firm based in Seattle. I wasn't flashy, I wasn't political, but I was damn good at my job. The kind of man who kept the lights on while others got the credit. I walked out of that glass building with a cardboard box of personal items and a smile that didn't reach my eyes. The security guard nodded at me on the way out. He didn't know he was watching a quiet detonation. I got home before noon. My wife, Laura, met me at the door, still in her nurse scrubs. "You're home early," she said, half concerned, half curious. "They let me go," I told her. She didn't speak, just placed a hand on my arm. That's the thing about good women. They don't panic when you should. After she left for her shift, I sat at my desk and began reading the severance paperwork. 6 weeks' pay, no mention of unused vacation, and a clause buried deep inside, one that would have made any lawyer's eyes narrow. Employee acknowledges that all stock options not vested prior to termination shall be forfeited. Except there was a problem. I hadn't been fired for cause. They'd written position eliminated. And somewhere in the shareholder plan documents, I remembered reading something different. All shares vest immediately upon termination without cause. It was a single sentence, one they probably hoped no one would ever notice. But I had built systems for Grayson. I knew how their data worked, and I never forgot details. That night, I called an old friend, Mark Hensley, attorney. He'd handled contract law for a defense firm for 20 years. When he picked up, I didn't waste words. "Mark, I need you to read something," I said. By morning, he'd called back. "You're right. That clause means your shares should have vested the moment they terminated you. HR either overlooked it, or someone wanted to keep it buried." "How much are we talking?" I asked. "Depends on your package, but I'd guess somewhere around $250,000. I stared at the phone, quiet. That wasn't severance money. That was life-changing money. Mark exhaled. "You want to handle this quietly, Jake. No threats, no emails. Just let me point it out, politely, to their legal team. See how they react." "Do it," I said. By Monday, Mark had sent the letter. A simple, clean notice outlining the oversight and requesting correction. HR replied within hours. "After careful review, we find this severance agreement consistent with company policy. The matter is closed." Standard policy again. Mark called me that evening. They're pretending it doesn't exist. But they know. I leaned back in my chair, staring out the window at the rain sliding down the glass. "Then we make them remember," I said. He paused. "How far are you willing to take this?" "As far as it takes." That was the night I stopped being their quiet systems guy and started being their problem. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I opened my old encrypted folders, the ones holding years of system access logs, internal emails, archived communications, every corner of the machine I'd built for them. And deep in those logs, I found something that made my pulse slow, not quicken. A quiet, steady certainty. Grayson Dynamics had been manipulating employee stock vesting records for years. And now, they'd done it to the wrong man. The thing about working in systems for nearly 2 decades is you start to see patterns, not just in code, but in people. HR hides behind phrases like policy compliance and company alignment. But somewhere behind those polished words, there's always someone making a choice. And choices leave fingerprints. I spent the next morning combing through old directories I'd backed up before leaving Grayson Dynamics. Nothing illegal, just data I'd mirrored years ago when I built their redundancy framework. Most of it was harmless: project schedules, payroll metadata, employee access logs. But buried in the archived audit trails was something that didn't belong. Stock vesting records. Specifically, the logs showing modification timestamps tied to executive accounts. My heart didn't race. It slowed. I'd seen this before, during a system audit 3 years earlier. Someone in finance had been quietly adjusting vesting dates, delaying them by weeks, sometimes months. That was a subtle way to reduce the number of employees eligible for full vesting before restructuring or layoffs. In other words, trimming costs by rewriting time itself. When I found it back then, I'd flagged it to my boss, Evan, the IT director. He'd thanked me, told me not to worry. A week later, the records were wiped clean, replaced with revised data. I assumed corporate legal had handled it. Now, sitting in my home office, I realized that was the first cover-up. This wasn't just about me losing out on stock. This was systemic. Someone had built a shadow process for altering vesting schedules, and HR was running interference for it. Mark called again that afternoon. His voice was calm, practiced. He said the company's counsel had responded, reaffirming their position. They're confident the severance is final, he told me. But they didn't deny the clause exists. That's the tell. They're scared to confirm it because that would open the door for every ex-employee to demand back pay. How many? I asked. He said he couldn't be sure. But if the logs were accurate, hundreds, maybe thousands. I didn't respond right away. I was thinking about the nights I'd stayed late during system migrations, alone in that freezing data center, doing the work no one else wanted. 17 years of loyalty, reduced to a form letter and a box. I didn't want revenge. Not yet. What I wanted was truth and leverage. I began quietly rebuilding the audit trail from backups I'd stored across 3 encrypted drives. Each timestamp, each access entry, each alteration. I layered them into a visual timeline, a map of manipulations spanning 5 fiscal years. When I finished, I sent one line to Mark. It's bigger than we thought. He called back immediately, asking what I meant. I told him it could qualify as securities fraud if the company knowingly falsified vesting records tied to shareholder equity. There was silence on the other end. Then he said something simple. Jake, if you're right, this isn't an HR problem. It's a federal one. That night, I sat in the dark, looking at my reflection in the monitor. My severance didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what they'd done. To me, to others, to the system we built. I didn't make threats. I didn't announce anything. I just opened a new file, labeled it Proof, and began writing everything down. Dates, names, access trails, the kind of record no lawyer could ignore. By morning, I had one more plan forming quietly in the back of my mind. I wasn't going to demand anything. I was going to let them walk into their own trap. And when they did, I'd be waiting. Grayson Dynamics was a company that prided itself on transparency, at least in public. Inside those glass walls, everything was mirrors. What you saw was never what was really there. I had spent too many years maintaining those reflections not to know where the cracks were. Over the next week, I worked in silence. Laura thought I was looking for new jobs. I didn't correct her. Every morning, I made coffee, opened my laptop, and went to work. Not for a company this time, but for myself. I started by reconstructing access patterns from the system logs I'd archived. Each modification to employee stock records left a digital footprint. Who made it, when, and what IP address they used. The deeper I went, the clearer the pattern became. It wasn't just HR. It wasn't just finance. There was a small group of executives who had quietly created a side structure, a review process that allowed them to adjust vesting schedules without board oversight. It was technically legal, if disclosed, but they hadn't disclosed anything, and that made it fraud. The access keys belonged to one department in particular, corporate finance, led by CFO Michael Reynolds. I'd met Reynolds maybe 3 times in my career, the kind of man who smiled like he already owned your future. His name appeared 47 times in the audit trail, tied to restricted changes made after hours. That detail mattered, because according to company policy, only HR could process terminations. When I told Mark, his voice went low. He said it sounded like corporate misconduct at the executive level. He asked what I planned to do next. I told him the truth. I was going to send Reynolds a copy of his own fingerprints. But not directly. Not yet. I drafted a report with every entry carefully formatted, every timestamp verified. It read less like an accusation and more like a mirror. Calm, factual, impossible to dismiss. I encrypted it, backed it up 3 times, and saved a hard copy in a safety deposit box across town. Then I waited. 3 days later, Reynolds himself reached out. He claimed he'd heard from HR that I'd been confused about my severance. He offered to clarify the details in person. I agreed, not because I needed clarity, but because I wanted to see his face. We met in the lobby cafe of the same building I'd been escorted out of 2 weeks earlier. He arrived exactly on time, carrying a calmness that only comes from money or arrogance, usually both. He talked about how unfortunate layoffs were, how grateful the company was for my service. I listened, nodding once in a while, never interrupting. When he finished his rehearsed speech, I told him I'd reviewed the shareholder plan again and found a discrepancy. His expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened on his coffee cup. He said legal had already reviewed everything, that my interpretation was understandable but inaccurate. That was when I slid the flash drive across the table. I told him it contained audit logs from Grayson's internal servers, records showing who modified employee vesting schedules and when. I didn't accuse him. I didn't raise my voice. I just said I thought he'd want to know, in case someone was abusing his credentials. He didn't touch the drive. He just looked at it, then at me. The silence stretched for several seconds before he spoke. He said he'd have the legal team look into it. I stood, thanked him for his time, and left. By the time I got home, Mark had already called. He said Reynolds had phoned him directly, asking for the exact scope of what we knew. That was how I knew I'd hit something vital. The next morning, my inbox was flooded with messages from former coworkers. The company had abruptly frozen all employee stock transactions, pending internal review. It had begun. The day after Reynolds and I met, Grayson Dynamics went silent. The kind of silence that only comes before something breaks. Their internal systems were still operational, but public communication stopped. No press releases. No LinkedIn posts. No updates. Just a sudden, collective hush. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I waited. Because when powerful people panic, they don't shout. They start whispering. Mark called that night, his tone steady but different. He said the company had hired outside counsel, a crisis management firm. They'd already requested copies of all communication between me, HR, and legal. That told me they were preparing for exposure. But the beauty of working in information systems is this. Every lie leaves metadata. Even deleted truth echoes somewhere. That weekend, I decided to take a quiet drive to the coast. I needed space to think, to decide whether I was going to keep pushing or let the machine devour itself. Laura thought I needed a break. She was half right. What I needed was perspective and distance from whatever was about to explode inside Grayson's walls. While I sat in that small motel room overlooking the gray Pacific, I mapped out everything on paper. A full chain of cause and effect. HR refused my severance adjustment. They cited standard policy. I uncovered proof of altered stock records. I sent it to the CFO. He panicked. Now, the company had frozen all equity accounts, risking the attention of their investors. If this went public, the stock would tank overnight. But I didn't want chaos for the sake of revenge. I wanted accountability. I wanted to see who would blink first. On Monday morning, Mark called again. He said something had shifted. Reynolds had reached out to him directly, trying to negotiate. Not publicly, not in writing, privately. He suggested that a settlement might be mutually beneficial. That was corporate code for hush money. Mark asked what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted the truth in writing, not a check. But I also knew Reynolds wasn't stupid. If he was willing to pay, that meant there was something worth hiding. So I agreed to let Mark play along. He would ask for a written proposal, something official enough to lock them into their own fear. While he handled that, I went back into my archives. I started looking for patterns not just in stock adjustments, but in who benefited. The results made my stomach turn. The same 5 executive names appeared every quarter before major layoffs. Each time, their own vesting schedules moved up, right before hundreds of employees lost theirs. It was elegant theft, legal on the surface, criminal beneath. By Wednesday, Mark forwarded me an unsigned settlement draft. It offered triple severance in exchange for complete confidentiality, non-disparagement, and forfeiture of any claim related to equity adjustments. They didn't even try to hide it. The wording confirmed everything. Mark said I could retire quietly with that offer. No press, no tension, just money and silence. He meant well, but he didn't understand what this was anymore. This wasn't a severance dispute. It was a system built to rob loyalty. That night, I looked at my reflection in the motel mirror and made a decision. I wasn't going to leak anything. I wasn't going to run to the press or post online. I was going to dismantle them from the inside, the same way they dismantled people like me, quietly, precisely, with patience. I emailed Mark a single line before going to bed. Tell them I'll think about it. It wasn't a lie. I just hadn't told them what I was really thinking. I was thinking about the shareholders' annual meeting 2 weeks away, and how, for the first time, they'd finally hear the truth from one of their own. 2 weeks. That's how long I had before Grayson's annual shareholders meeting. 2 weeks to prepare for the only moment where people like Reynolds couldn't hide behind HR, policy, or legal jargon. At that meeting, everything would be recorded, transcribed, archived, and I planned to make sure my evidence found its way there. I wasn't invited, of course. Only current employees, board members, and major shareholders could attend. But I still owned a small number of vested shares from years back, enough to grant me access to investor communications. That was the key. They'd sent me proxy documents, digital voting links, and a passcode for livestream access. I wouldn't be in the room physically, but I didn't need to be. I just needed to control what the right people saw at the right time. I spent each night building a presentation. Not one I'd show publicly, but a quiet compilation of facts, screenshots, transaction histories, internal memos, time-stamped access logs. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The numbers would speak louder than any accusation ever could. Mark kept calling. He said Reynolds' office was getting impatient. They wanted an answer about the settlement. I told him to stall. He asked why, and I told him I was reviewing terms. In truth, I was watching them scramble. Every day they delayed the shareholders' meeting announcement. Every day they rechecked the equity portal. Their silence confirmed they were nervous. On the 5th day, my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. It was a woman from the firm's internal legal department, not the outside attorneys. She said she wanted to clarify some aspects of the separation. Her voice was careful, as if each word had been weighed before it left her mouth. I let her speak. She hinted that errors in record-keeping sometimes occurred during transitions and that Grayson wanted to ensure I was treated fairly. That was when I knew the walls were starting to move. Reynolds had realized that keeping me quiet wasn't enough anymore. Now, he wanted to rewrite the narrative, make it look like they were fixing a clerical issue, not covering up a deliberate scheme. But I'd already anticipated that. I had written a letter addressed to the board's audit committee chair, attaching the evidence packet. The letter didn't accuse anyone by name. It simply stated that I believed irregularities existed within the company's stock vesting records and that they appeared to benefit select executives at the expense of terminated employees. I wrote it like a professional report, calm, unemotional, irrefutable. When I was done, I scheduled the email to send automatically 15 minutes before the annual meeting began. After that, I waited. The night before the meeting, Laura noticed I wasn't sleeping. She didn't ask why. She'd learned by then that my silences weren't avoidance. They were strategy. She said she trusted me, kissed my shoulder, and went to bed. At 8 a.m. the next morning, Grayson Dynamics streamed the shareholder meeting live. Reynolds stood at the podium, smiling that same polished smile he always wore when pretending everything was fine. He began with the usual numbers: quarterly growth, market projections, the illusion of stability. At 8:15, my email delivered. By 8:17, the livestream chat froze. The screen cut briefly to the company logo. And by 8:23, the CFO's smile was gone. He had just received my report, along with every member of the board. When the livestream glitched, I knew I'd hit the artery. Companies don't freeze shareholder broadcasts unless something's bleeding behind the curtain. I sat in my kitchen, laptop open, coffee untouched, watching the screen flicker from the corporate logo to static, then back again. For nearly 2 minutes, nothing moved. No sound. No CFO. No corporate smiles. Just silence. The kind that only comes when people in suits are whispering to each other off camera, trying to figure out how much damage they're looking at. Then the feed returned. The room looked different now. The lighting seemed harsher. Reynolds was gone from the podium, replaced by the company's chief legal officer, a woman I'd only seen in internal memos. Her tone was calm, but her eyes gave her away. She announced a brief, technical delay and said the meeting would resume shortly. She didn't mention the email. She didn't have to. Mark called 10 minutes later. He'd already heard from one of his contacts inside the firm. The board had gone into a closed session mid-meeting. That almost never happened. It meant the allegations in my report were being treated as serious, possibly criminal. I didn't feel triumph. I felt stillness, like a sniper watching through a scope, breathing slow and steady, waiting to see who would move first. By afternoon, Grayson's website had gone into maintenance mode. Their investor relations portal displayed a single sentence: meeting materials temporarily unavailable pending internal review. That was corporate code for damage control. Laura came home from work and saw the laptop still open. She asked if it was over. I told her it was only beginning. She didn't press for details. That was one of the many reasons I loved her. That night, my phone buzzed again. It was an email from an anonymous address. The subject line read, "We need to talk." The body contained one sentence: "You don't understand what you've started." Attached was a short video clip, security footage from the Grayson parking garage. It showed Reynolds walking quickly toward his car, looking over his shoulder, then climbing in and slamming the door. They were watching him now. Maybe the board. Maybe regulators. Or maybe he'd started cleaning up his own trail. Either way, it meant pressure. And pressure cracks people like him. Mark called again at dawn. He said the board had appointed an external auditor, an independent firm to review all financial activity tied to executive compensation. That was confirmation enough. My evidence had forced them to act. Still, I knew how these things worked. They'd spin it as a compliance review, distance themselves from blame, sacrifice one or two executives to protect the rest. I'd seen this dance before, but I had more left to show. There were still documents I hadn't released. The internal memo authorizing manual edits to the stock database, signed by Reynolds himself, and the email chain between him and HR, discussing how to align vesting to optimize budget impact. I hadn't sent those yet. They were insurance. When I told Mark, he went quiet. He said the company would likely contact me soon, not through HR this time, but through their board counsel. He said to stay calm, let them make the first move. So I did. For 2 days, nothing. No calls. No emails. Just silence again. Then, on the morning of the third day, a new message arrived in my inbox. It was from the board chair himself. Formal, polite, but heavy. He requested a private meeting, off the record, to clarify matters related to the recent audit submission. That was their next move. They wanted to see if the quiet man who broke their system could be persuaded to fix it again. The email from the board chair came at 7:42 a.m., timestamped 5 minutes after the markets opened. That timing wasn't random. It meant they were trying to contain a situation before it grew teeth. The wording was polished, sterile, every sentence designed to sound harmless. They requested a confidential discussion about my concerns and potential collaborative solutions. I knew what that really meant. They wanted to neutralize me quietly before this reached the SEC. I read the message twice, then forwarded it to Mark without a note. He called within minutes. His voice was steady, but his words carried weight. He said they were scared, that the board chair wouldn't reach out directly unless the audit had already uncovered something substantial. He advised caution: meet them, listen, but say nothing without counsel present. I agreed. The meeting was set for Friday morning at an office downtown, not Grayson's headquarters. Neutral ground. I arrived early, parked across the street, and watched the building for 10 minutes before going in. Old habits die hard. Inside, the room smelled like paper and control. 3 people sat at the long conference table: the board chair, the company's outside counsel, and a compliance officer I didn't recognize. No coffee, no small talk, just quiet tension. The chair thanked me for coming, said they appreciated my commitment to integrity. He used that word, integrity, like a shield. He explained they were conducting a full review of the stock program, that preliminary findings suggested inconsistencies. He said they wanted to ensure I was properly compensated for any oversight, but also that I understood the importance of discretion. I listened. When he finished, I asked one question: whether those inconsistencies appeared to benefit certain executives. He hesitated before saying the review was ongoing. That told me enough. They weren't denying it anymore. They were negotiating the narrative. After an hour of polite evasion, the attorney slid an envelope across the table. Inside was a proposed agreement, settlement, confidentiality, and a non-admission clause. The number was much higher this time. enough to make most people disappear quietly. I closed the envelope and placed it back in front of them. I said I'd review it with counsel and left. No threats, no theatrics, just calm. Outside, I called Mark. He asked how it went. I told him they were offering silence at a premium. He sighed and said that was progress. I said it was confession. That afternoon, I received another email, this one not from the board but from a blocked address. The subject read, "They're investigating Reynolds." No body text, just an attachment. It was a leaked internal memo detailing the board's emergency vote to place the CFO on leave pending the audit outcome. The machine was eating itself now. Mark called again that night, sounding almost relieved. He said the board had formally reported the issue to regulators. That meant external oversight was inevitable. I asked what that meant for us. He said it meant we'd won. But I didn't feel like I'd won. Not yet. Because I knew how these stories ended. One or two executives resign, a press release about restructuring, then silence. The system would repair itself, and the people who built it would walk away untouched. Unless someone made the silence impossible. I looked at the files still sitting on my desk. The ones I hadn't released. The ones that showed Reynolds wasn't the only name tied to those adjustments. There were two others, senior executives with direct lines to the board. If the audit only saw what they were meant to see, the truth would die quietly. And I wasn't built for quiet endings. After the memo leaked, things started moving faster. The financial press caught wind of unexplained executive leave at Grayson Dynamics. Nothing specific, just whispers in the business pages, but it was enough. Stock prices dipped 4% overnight. Investors started asking questions the board wasn't ready to answer. And that was before I sent the second file. It wasn't impulsive. Nothing I did was. I waited 3 full days after the CFO's suspension before sending the next packet, anonymously, to the same audit firm the board had hired. Inside were 2 internal emails, written months apart, both referencing strategic alignment of vesting. The signatures belonged to 2 senior vice presidents, operations and HR. The same people who'd signed my termination paperwork. The next morning, those 2 executives were placed on administrative leave pending review. The board called it precautionary. I called it inevitable. Mark phoned as soon as the announcement hit. His voice had that mix of disbelief and admiration that comes from watching something planned actually work. He asked how I got those files. I told him I'd had them for years, archived like everything else. He said he was starting to think I could teach a course in controlled demolition. I didn't respond. I wasn't celebrating. I'd seen how companies rewrite history. They'd fire a few people, issue a statement about strengthened compliance, and by next quarter, investors would move on. Grayson would survive. Reynolds and his partners would take settlements and quietly disappear into consulting jobs somewhere else. That wasn't enough for me, because this was never about money anymore. It was about exposure, the kind that couldn't be deleted or rebranded. So I went one step further. I compiled everything, the audit trails, emails, board communications, even the legal correspondence with Mark, into a single digital package. Then I uploaded it to an encrypted drive and attached a timed release key, scheduled for automatic distribution to major business journalists if I didn't cancel it within 30 days. It wasn't blackmail. It was insurance. I left one note in the file header, in case the truth goes missing again. That night, the board's attorney called. She said the company appreciated my cooperation, that my contributions had been instrumental in identifying internal irregularities. She said the board wanted to offer me a consulting role to help modernize oversight systems. Her tone was smooth, practiced. It was an olive branch, one dipped in poison. I told her I'd think about it, though I already knew my answer. I wasn't stepping back into that building, not even as a guest. The next week was quiet. Too quiet. The media chatter faded. Grayson's PR team started controlling the story. Reynolds was retiring to focus on personal matters. The 2 suspended executives chose to pursue other opportunities. The board announced a new compliance initiative, complete with glossy photos and buzzwords. It almost worked. For a moment, it seemed like the company might survive untouched, that my story would be buried under spin. Then, on a rainy Thursday morning, the Department of Justice announced a federal inquiry into Grayson Dynamics for possible securities and records manipulation. The headline was short. The impact was not. Mark called immediately. He said the DOJ cited independent whistleblower documentation in their report. He paused, then asked if I'd done something. I said no, but I didn't have to. Some truths have a way of surfacing on their own once the water's been stirred. When the DOJ stepped in, everything changed. Grayson Dynamics was no longer in control of its own story. The investigation went public within 24 hours, and the company's stock fell 12% by the next morning. Financial channels started using words like fraud, insider manipulation, and executive misconduct, the kind of words no corporate lawyer can sanitize once they hit print. For the first time, I didn't have to do anything. The system I had built, my careful trail of evidence, each timestamp and document, had become self-sustaining. It no longer needed me to push it forward. It had momentum. Mark called daily, mostly to keep me updated, partly to make sure I was still calm. He said regulators were moving fast, interviewing former employees, combing through emails, freezing assets tied to Reynolds and the others. He also said my name had come up, not as a suspect, but as the whistleblower who'd provided the key evidence. I asked if that was a problem. He said it wasn't, not legally, but the press would come eventually. They always did. I didn't want headlines. I just wanted the truth to stay alive long enough to matter. For a week, I stayed quiet, watching the story unfold. Reporters started tracing the timeline, the layoffs, the falsified vesting schedules, the selective bonuses. The narrative wrote itself. Grayson Dynamics executives accused of defrauding employees out of vested stock worth millions. It was strange seeing my years of quiet work turned into a headline. My name wasn't mentioned, but I recognized my fingerprints everywhere, in the phrasing, the structure, even the sequence of facts. Then, one morning, there was a knock at the door. A woman introduced herself as Special Agent Carter with the Financial Crimes Division. She said she wanted to thank me for cooperating and confirm a few details for the record. Her voice was professional, but her expression carried something like respect. She said my documentation had been crucial to establishing probable cause. She called it a remarkably organized submission. I said it wasn't about organization. It was about accuracy. She nodded and left me her card. Before she walked away, she said something I didn't expect. She said most whistleblowers act out of anger. Mine, she said, read like it came from discipline. She was right. Anger burns fast. Discipline lasts. Over the next few months, Grayson collapsed from the inside. Reynolds pled guilty to securities fraud in exchange for cooperation. 2 other executives followed. The board issued a public apology, though not to me, not to the hundreds of employees who'd been cheated, just to the shareholders. Because in the corporate world, contrition is measured in percentages, not sincerity. When Mark called with the final update, I was sitting on the porch watching the rain. He said the settlement was finalized. The DOJ had recovered enough assets to compensate every affected employee. He said they'd included me in the restitution, even though I wasn't required to be. I asked how much. He told me the number. It was more than I'd lost. Much more. I thanked him, but didn't ask for the check to be expedited. Money was never the point. The system had spoken, and for once, it hadn't whispered. That night, I deleted every backup, every file, every trace of the war I'd fought. I kept only one thing, a single printed page from the DOJ's report. It listed the charges, the names, and at the bottom, one line that made it all worth it. Evidence provided by an independent former employee was instrumental in securing convictions. I folded it once and locked it away. The story was over. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was earned. The story should have ended there, with the indictments, the restitution, the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth had surfaced. But life doesn't always grant clean endings. Sometimes it leaves you standing in the wreckage you helped uncover, unsure whether you built justice or just another version of it. Weeks after the DOJ announcement, I began getting messages from people I hadn't spoken to in years, former coworkers, analysts, technicians. They all said the same thing. They thanked me. Some wrote that they'd recovered lost stock value. Others said they'd finally been heard. One man said he could pay for his daughter's college now because of what I did. I didn't reply to any of them. I didn't need thanks. I just needed the noise to stop. Grayson Dynamics was no longer the company I had worked for. Its logo was gone, replaced after a merger designed to distance the new entity from the scandal. Reynolds was sentenced to 3 years. The others took plea deals. The board members survived, of course. They always do. But their names would forever carry the shadow of the investigation. For me, life became simple again. I spent mornings fixing things around the house, afternoons walking with Laura, evenings without screens. I thought maybe that's how it would stay. Quiet. Still. Until one afternoon a letter arrived. No logo. No return address. Just a single page inside, typed neatly. It was from the new board of directors of the restructured company. They said they were creating a permanent oversight position, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer. They wanted me to take it. I read the letter twice. The offer was generous: salary, equity, full control of audit systems. They promised transparency. They promised reform. But I knew what promises were worth in that world. When I showed Laura, she didn't say anything at first. Then she asked what I wanted. I told her I didn't know yet. That was partly true. I wanted to believe a company could rebuild itself honestly. But I'd also spent enough time watching how power mutates. And I knew what my acceptance would mean. It would make me part of the machine again, even if I was the one holding the wrench. That night, I walked out to the porch and sat alone, the letter folded in my hand. The city lights shimmered in the distance, cold and indifferent. I thought about the years I'd given that company, the loyalty they'd discarded, and the silence I'd weaponized to bring them down. Justice had come, but peace hadn't followed. I took the letter, tore it in half, and dropped it into the fire pit. The paper curled, turned black, and vanished into smoke. Sometimes the real victory isn't rebuilding what broke. It's walking away from it entirely. I went inside, poured a glass of water, and looked at the reflection in the kitchen window. The man staring back wasn't the systems engineer anymore. He wasn't the whistleblower either. He was just someone who'd learned that silence, when used right, can echo louder than any voice. Some people burn bridges. I dismantled mine, bolt by bolt, file by file, until nothing was left for anyone to cross again. And when the last ember outside went dark, I finally felt it. Not triumph, not revenge, just the quiet, the kind that stays. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.